Hey, everybody. This is your daily dose of all things royal. Welcome back, my gorgeous, good looking friends. Yes, down the rabbit hole I went again. But before I get into it, check out Prince Harry today at the Santa Bali Polo Cup. Even though Prince Harry lost, Nacho was gracious enough to share the award with him. Unfortunately, Harry just didn't want to give back the award or allow Nacho to pose with it with his team. I don't think Harry anticipated losing today, and it certainly didn't go the way that he wanted it to. As you can see, it's a bit awkward, and he is desperately trying to stay in the center stage with Nacho for these pictures, and in a way, selfish to let Nacho and his team celebrate. And you can see that here. How appropriate. Harry is listed as number 2 on his jersey. As you can see, the guy's trying to move him over to the other side, but Harry definitely wanted to be in the middle. I'm pretty sure Harry's PR team is going to spin this narrative of Harry and Nacho tying in this game, and they decided to share this award when in actuality it was Nacho's team that won. But, we know how they play these games. Anyhow, Meghan's ridiculous PR stunt yesterday didn't really do much damage. So, if anything, perhaps maybe it was directed at Harry to throw him off his game. Clearly, as you can see here in the US at 10:26 a.m. this morning, East Coast time, this was what was reflecting for top stories when you Google Meghan Markle. So whatever Meghan was trying to do failed. And at the same time, same thing for Harry. His stories kind of failed because look who is number 1. It says how William won America. And can Harry and Meghan win it back? I'm sure Meghan is not too pleased to see that her PR stunt really didn't do very much. Even after all of this effort to stay in the news and in front of people's faces, newspapers and media just don't care anymore and are putting stories that the public actually wants to read about, which are the ones we're seeing here now. You know that both of them are going to be pissed off, and it's going to fuel even further their attempts and effort to censor online, as well as Harry's crusade against suppressing and censoring the media. Now, we don't know the motivations for all these puff pieces being pushed out and by who, but we can guess as to where they're coming from, as well as understand, the pattern and behavior that we've seen over the last several years and how Meghan and Harry have weaponized the media. And I raise this topic today in this video because I want us to understand why we're seeing some of the bizarre articles that keep coming out in the press about this couple. Now, I'm not saying that part of this media distraction by Meghan and Harry was in any way, shape, form to deflect away attention from this past Thursday's hearing at the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals regarding this landmark censorship case, Missouri versus Biden. This time now, Facebook has been pulled into question with now Facebook files. Just like the Twitter files, there exists Facebook files, and if there are Facebook files, then I am pretty sure there are YouTube files. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is because this is all part of this censorship industrial complex in which Meghan and Harry have been a part of. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about and want a little more background, I created a playlist and 3 videos that do cover this in depth. But at a high level, this censorship industrial complex is a network of government agencies, academic institutions, and NGOs that are censoring ordinary citizens on a whole host of issues. And what is now being exposed is that governments of democracies have been censoring and deplatforming ordinary citizens. We have been seeing this in Ireland to Germany, Canada to Mexico. All these laws now trying to be passed through in stifling people's free speech. The US is the biggest country to be toppled in passing legislation that aligns with a lot of these European countries that have been passing these kinds of restriction laws. I've said this before, these are the organizations that are part of this censorship industrial complex in which Meghan and Harry are directly, heavily involved with, particularly Harry and the Aspen Institute and being on that commission for disinformation disorder nonsense. Now, I'm going to continue to keep bringing this up whenever I talk about the censorship industrial complex. Harry is on record stating that he knew about a coup January 6th happening the day before. So Why hasn't anybody from our government pulled him in for questioning?
Prior to January the 6th, where I warned him that his platform was allowing a coup to be staged. That email was sent the day before, and then it happened, and I haven't heard from him since.
Participating in that global broadcast with Harry was former CIA head researcher at Stanford University, technical advisor on the Aspen Institute Commission for Disinformation, and at Prince Harry and Meghan's disposal, Renee Diresta. It's important to understand that Renee Diresta is a part of this Missouri versus Biden landmark court case, and she played a significant role at the Stanford Internet Observatory. She, as well as Alex Stamos, who was also another commissioner in which Harry collaborated with, are getting sued in Louisiana and in Texas for violating Americans' First Amendment rights, along with other state actors that are a part of this censorship industrial complex. So, circling back to Meghan Markle and Harry and their bizarre media blitzes that they go on, does echo almost verbatim to what the Aspen Digital or the arm of Aspen Institute have been pushing and preaching as part of this censorship industrial complex. One particular video that we're going to dissect now is with Renee Diresta talking about conspiracy theories and coordinated campaigns.
My name is Vivian Schiller, and I am Executive Director of Aspen Digital, which is a program of the Aspen Institute.
Just to give you a little background on who this woman is, she was caught in a bit of a scandal in 2011 when she was working at NPR and was fired. Fast forward, she's now the head of this division and caught up again within the Twitter files.
Gamed out a whole multi-day event in which they played out a scenario where if something happened to Hunter Biden that showed his shady business dealings with his dad, we would have a game plan in place with the media to respond to it. Okay? I mean, really? This is true. So Michael Schellenberger reporting in the Twitter files, the organizer of this event was Vivian Schiller, the former CEO of NPR, the former head of news at Twitter, former general manager of New York Times, former chief digital officer of NBC News. Attendees included Meta's Facebook head of security policy and the top national security reporters for the New York Times, Washington Post, and others. Now, according to the Daily Caller, the training exercise was titled The Burisma Leak. The Burisma Leak. Like, what a title.
This session is part of a series of briefings on mis and disinformation that we're hosting here at the Aspen Institute in tandem with our Commission on Information Disorder. As part of this series, we're talking to top experts in the field who can help us make sense of all the various facets of the information crisis we're experiencing now. In today's episode, I am speaking with Renee Diresta. Among other things, she investigates disinformation and propaganda by state-sponsored actors and conspiracy theories. Are conspiracy theories on the rise, or does it just feel that way?
So there was this really remarkable moment in time, 2015 to 2019 or so, when these communities were growing on social media numerically. We knew that. We didn't know if that was necessarily translating into changes in behavior. Was this just aggregating all of the people who were already inclined, or was this creating converts? And I think that is still an area that we don't have necessarily the best visibility.
Keep in the back of your mind that Renee is one of those researchers who has been calling upon more transparency and regulation around allowing user data to be accessible to researchers and academia. Prince Harry's commission report that was funded by the U.S. taxpayer, Harry's report heavily emphasized more transparency around user data given to researchers like Renee Diresta. Also, they had made the suggestion that journalists, as well as these so-called researchers, be protected should they violate any platform policy in the name of civic interest. Now, you know what that sounds like. Sounds like, hey, these journalists can dox you and expose you, put your life in danger, but nothing's going to happen to these journalists because they're doing this for the greater good of the community. Like, I really want you to understand how dangerous this is. So when we look at this censorship industrial complex and know that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle have their sticky little fingers all up in each one of these different pockets, would you want your data, be exposed and allowed to be used by these so-called researchers, be shared with R12 Foundation, since they're in contractual agreement and thus an extension of that think tank or that entity or organization. So this framework that Renee Diresta is so gung-ho about and pushing for on behalf of the US government and the current administration is to get regulation passed in order to legally violate Americans' First Amendment rights as well as their Fourth Amendment rights, giving up any kind of privacy in order for them to survey your behavior. And if it's not falling in line, clearly, as you can see, there are recommendations to penalize people, whether putting them in a holding area and suppressing them from being able to, contribute more, demonetization, take away those incentives so you can't earn anything. And finally, this cross-platform visibility. And that's not just on social media apps, but this is across any kind of digital space. And we're seeing that with legislation that now has been introduced by Michael Bennet. That was part of the Intelligence Committee, the committee that Meghan wanted to slip into under Dianne Feinstein's. And this pretty much sums up the real intention. It says, while the protection of user privacy is important, yeah, they understand that people will care about that. Pay attention to how they worded this. Platforms should not be permitted to use privacy as a pretext for restricting and stopping research and journalism in cases where the risk to privacy is minimal in relation to the public interest in the research, as Stanford professor Nate Persley has proposed. You can tell that this is delicately worded. I mean, they're acknowledging that privacy is important to people. However, they don't care. They want to make it so that platforms can't use the excuse of privacy and protecting the individual by restricting access to people like Renee Diresta and journalists like Jack Royston from accessing people's private data in the name of civic public interest. So not only do they want the government to pass a law that allows independent agencies of their choice, they also want the FTC to also have the ability to mandate disclosure of your private data information. I'll get into the FTC's gross abuse of power a little later on, but let's continue.
So there's an interesting dynamic of not only how does social media kind of aggregate people, again, nudging people to join these communities, but also beyond that, the question of to what extent does that visibility of media coverage potentially inadvertently amplify those dynamics, then making more people go search. And once you have more people searching, again, then they're finding the content on social media, then they've signaled that they're interested in the content, and then potentially there's this dynamic where the content continues to be pushed to them.
So let's quickly take a look at how Meghan applied this concept in reverse. She understands this principle all too well, as she did everything in her power to get YouTube to affect all our channels. Or at least that was the perception that Meghan wanted everybody to have, and the reason why Smelly Hall wrote this article. YouTube did not derank us alone. There was just a whole plethora of accounts that had been evaluated across the platform itself. And if you read the article further down, YouTube does respond to Smelly and tells her that no, that's not true, and goes into explaining what had gone on with the recent changes on the platform. But chances are many people didn't get that far down in order to read that part and just read this clickbait title to push another false narrative.
Yeah, this is a tricky balance for journalists, certainly, because these are real trends. These are real phenomena. They have real world impact. We saw some of it on January 6th. You need to cover it, but how do you cover it without inadvertently even with debunking? How do you cover it without inadvertently amplifying and sending more people down that conspiracy theory rabbit hole?
In other words, how do you control the public from using their critical thinking skills and coming to their own conclusion, essentially thinking for themselves? And if it is not aligned with what agenda or ideology that is being pushed. This regime doesn't want you asking questions. This regime doesn't want you talking to other people. And this regime does not want you to look at other sources that are not approved by them.
Gamed out a whole multi-day event in which they played out a scenario where if something happened to Hunter Biden that showed his shady business dealings with his dad, we would have a game plan in place with the media to respond to it.
there are some really interesting incentive dynamics that we're contending with, which is that oftentimes people will only see the headline, particularly if the article is going by on Twitter. They're not going to necessarily click through and read it. And so
that's exactly what happened with this article that I mentioned earlier.
To motivate people to click on the headlines are often sensational and overly simplistic, right? And so you do have a dynamic where, kind of the epidemic of clickbait, if you will, where stories are framed in the simplest way possible, the most interesting, sensational sounding way possible, because that's what performs well on social media. I think the other dynamic, though, with this is the phrasing that people use in their headlines, or the phrasing that people use in their content is potentially also very impactful. People will hear a term and they'll go and they'll type it into a search box. So even independently of social media, just information architecture, they'll go and they'll type it into Google. And what's going to come up is the content that is most sort of salient, most relevant to that term.
Who could forget Meghan talking about this algorithms of oppression and how racist search engines are, according to this book by Safiya Noble, who, by the way, was also a commissioner working on that report with Harry for Aspen.
And so if this is a new term or a conspiracy theorist's term, what you're going to find is a pathway into that content, that sort of conspiratorial rabbit hole that potentially kind of you start because you see a term in news coverage and you wonder what it is, or you see a phrase on social media and you wonder what it is, and then you go looking, and instead of a nice nuanced Wikipedia article with...
You heard that, folks. A nice nuanced Wikipedia article, aka sanitized to their idea of acceptable. For a woman who is allegedly intelligent is failing to realize or forgetting to remember that the internet was built on people with very diverse ideas and creative thought and individuality, to which it has evolved and advanced our society in intelligence.
The full details of the issue, you find the content that is again potentially most sensational or most linked to, or in a lot of cases it's the only content available to return for that term.
So I know that was the case with a lot of at least in the early days of the anti-vax movement, people would search for things like, whatever, the childhood vaccine and autism. And because there was no scientific corollary, there was no article about it, but what would pop up are these conspiracy theories.
And here's the irritating thing about stupid people like this. They want you to stay equally stupid with them. I don't want to get into the whole vaccine discussion, but people should have the right to educate themselves. And from what it sounds like from this woman, she doesn't want people to go outside the sources that they put in front of you to make sure that you are compliant in what the government wants. And now all of this is coming full circle in these court cases and is coming out to show that they were wrong in what they did, in which Meghan and Harry were very much a part of.
When we're talking about bad actors using conspiracy theories and doubt, what do they use to try to influence people? Those who are purposefully going out into the world trying to spread conspiracy theories on purpose. What goes into a disinformation campaign?
Yeah, so for a disinformation campaign, we're talking about something with a deliberate intent, right? That's really the definition, that as unsatisfying as it can be relative to how do we determine intent, that is really the definition that we're using right now. So someone who is willfully trying to influence and deceive the public. One type of campaign is to distract. And by distracting someone, you kind of like a look over here, don't pay attention to this other thing. We're going to push a whole lot of other stuff at you so that you're paying more attention to another issue or another type of content. Sometimes that distraction takes the form of throwing so many different conflicting stories out into the world that it just becomes a kind of paralysis. It's just too hard to know what's true. So there's that fundamental question of who can tell what is true or what is true, undermining your confidence in your ability to even discern truth, to even identify which sources might help you discern truth, to just make it feel like an absolute paralysis. That's one of the types of campaigns that we see. The other type is the persuasion campaign. And what you have instead is a long game approach to trying to make people shift in their alignment on an issue. So much more of like when we say persuasion campaign, they want a community of people to think or feel a certain way. And that's much more of a traditional kind of propaganda model, where it is creating a relationship of trust with something that is not what it seems to be.
I want you to know that for me, I am here with you as a mother, as a wife, as a woman of color, and as your sister.
You pretend to be a Black Lives Matter activist, and then you speak to your audience as if you're one of them. You're communicating from a position of trust. So again, this all comes down to these questions of trust and truth, right? Can you figure out what's true? Who do you trust to tell you what's true? Well, here I am, and I'm a person just like you, and let's talk about this issue of this 2016 election. And as members of this community, here's how we should feel. And so the framing is always around, as a fellow member of your community, as a fellow feminist.
But I also know that there's a way for us to reframe this for you and to not see this as
the end of something, but instead to see this as the beginning of you harnessing all of the work, all the values, all the skills that you have embodied over the last 4 years, and now you channel that. Now all of that work gets activated. Now you get to be part of rebuilding. And I know sometimes people say, how many times do we need to rebuild? Well, you know what? We are going to rebuild and rebuild and rebuild until it is rebuilt. And I remember the curfew, and I remember rushing back home, and on that drive home, seeing ash fall from the sky and smelling the smoke and seeing the smoke billow out of buildings and seeing people run out of buildings carrying bags and looting. And I remember seeing men in the back of a van just holding guns and rifles. And I remember pulling up to the house and seeing the tree that had always been there completely charred.
And those memories don't go away.
I am so proud to call each of you a fellow alumni, and I'm so eager to see what you're going to do.
Please know that I am cheering you on all along the way.
It doesn't even matter if it's related to voting or something else. The point is to speak authentically as a member of that community, occupying a position of trust to try to persuade them, to try to nudge them toward a particular point of view.
You are going to use your voice in a stronger way than you've ever been able to, because most of you are 18 or you're going to turn 18, so you're going to vote.
What are the most concerning conspiracy theories you're seeing take root?
Well, a lot of what we look at isn't so much the specifics of the conspiracy theories, right? We see this as we look more at how do people come to consensus? How do they make sense of something? And conspiracy theories are concerning as an erosion in that process of coming to consensus. So it's more, how does the information infrastructure, how does the architecture enable people to come to consensus and make sense of things? How do we think about the idea, an idea of an informed public at this point, given that the infrastructure, the architecture, and the incentives, right, what we sometimes call the affordances and the algorithms. What can you do on these platforms? What is algorithmically done for you? And then the policies, what is allowed to stay on the platform? How do we think about this architecture, this information space, and what it facilitates, what it enables? So while there are some very, very wonderful things that come out of it, there are also some deeply pathological things that come out of it. And the conspiracy theories sort of fall more into the realm of the latter. So the problem is that the stuff can and does have real world impact.
I mean, we certainly can't find a consensus if we're not united on what constitutes evidence-based reality, which is what we're seeing.
Again, this ignorant woman is talking out of her ass. Of course, we need to have dialogue, but the problem is that people like this talk a big game, but they never actually bring together both sides of the house to understand other people's perspectives. And this one-sided biased mindset is what is killing and crushing society.
What do we do about all this? What can the platforms do around this in terms of content moderation? Is there anything that the federal government can do in terms of regulation or legislation? Civil society, education?
First things first, the U.S. taxpayer money needs to stop funding organizations such as this. Second, they need to clean house and get rid of all these people because they were a part of affecting so many millions of Americans directly and indirectly as a result of violating their rights, including with the U.S. government to do it. There's no way in hell I would want any of these people having my personal data and privacy information in order to control what I believe and what I think. In the next video that I do, we're going to talk all about what the US and the UK are doing to manipulate and control its own people in collaboration with each other.
First, I think is the recognition that we're not going to moderate our way out of this, and that this is not just a social media problem. So as we try to engage with people who are immersed in particular media ecosystems, I don't think that that's going to be solved with better online moderation or, anti-harassment tools. I think really it comes down to much more of a process of reconnecting people within ideas of community and re-emphasizing that these are your fellow citizens and restoring that trust.
Oh, the irony! It's too much!
Then I think there's the challenge of, again, on the same front, trust, media, restoring trust in media. I think that media and institutions have communicated in very traditional patterns for a very long time. There's a belief that top-down authority and top-down expertise are how people make sense of the world. And that's just not true in the communication ecosystem that we have today. One of the things that we saw quite a bit in our election integrity work that we're also seeing in our vaccine observations now is the idea of the bottom-up sense making, where instead of seeing information from a trusted authority or institution, you instead see somebody post something to Twitter or to Facebook, and then people begin to investigate or discern what that thing is, how it fits into a broader narrative. And then oftentimes, unfortunately, the narrative turns into a conspiracy theory. So I think the recognition that if people want information about COVID or about elections, the government and authority and mainstream media are not the only sources at their disposal anymore. They can go from this much more bottom-up dynamic. So understanding what's happening within those communities for media and institutions to participate.
So if you really listen to what she's saying, she understands that people are getting their media from other sources that are not controlled at the top, which that was back in the day where the government had more control on the people in whatever that they pushed out for people to see. Now that there's alternate sources, they're losing that type of control. So what's the next thing to do, which is invade people's space and monitoring communications? You're going to hear her say that we have to communicate differently.
I think that we need to see much more of a change in communication style. So not so much journals and PDFs and press conferences, but much more regular, repetitive engagement on within these spaces where people are coming to consensus about things.
And this is Nazi Germany all over again, putting people in the communities, watching, listening, and then saturating the media with nonstop propaganda. And thankfully, we have witnessed this firsthand with Meghan and Harry. So we know that this is not conspiracy, and it's happening, not only with them, but with other topics happening that are being pushed by a certain political agenda.
I think ultimately it's three things, right? We've got policy, education, and design. And so policy, whether that's regulatory or self-regulatory from the tech companies, gives us some levers. Education, and that's really getting people to understand a little bit more about how they engage and what they engage with, what they see online.
How they engage and what they engage with, what they see online.
They literally want to control who you talk to, what you see, who you engage with. I really hope that this woman is found guilty and goes to jail.
And again, restoring those sort of shared bonds. And then design, and that's where I think we can be rethinking things like curation and amplification to put more reputable, less sensational content in front of people as well.
But you made a really important point. Well, you made a bunch of really important points, but in particular, which is, which I think comes down to trust. Who do you trust?
Certainly not you, bitch. Let's not forget, under her watch, she allowed Harry to be a part of this organization. Stay tuned for part 2, as we will go into talking about the US and UK's relationship and roles that they have been playing within this censorship industrial complex. Make no mistake, this is a global reform that is being pushed. And these two are still very much actively a part of it. So please make sure that you're subscribed and you have your notification bell on, because you don't want to miss the second part to this. Anyhow, definitely let me know your thoughts below. And as always, you know that I will be back. But until then, please be safe and I'll talk to you soon. Bye.
I was such a fraud.